Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, we continue our dialogues on war which started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is already episode number 37 in our series of conversations. We're discussing here different aspects to share this knowledge with you, our listeners, who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. І ми продовжуємо наші діалоги про війну, що розпочалися разом із повномасштабним вторгненням Росії в Україну. Це вже 37-й епізод нашої серії розмов, де ми обговорюємо різні аспекти, аби поділитися із вами, нашими слухачами, які прагнуть дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути з першоджерел. This is a project of Pan Ukraine, who are in Ukraine right now fighting for their freedom and indeed their very lives under the continuing Russian invasion. We express our support and admiration for their dedication and commitment, as well as for the indefatigable spirit of all Ukrainians who are fighting today. Це проєкт українського пану, члени якого зараз перебувають в Україні і борються за свою свободу, а власне й за своє життя під загрозою триваючого вторгнення. Ми вчергове висловлюємо нашу підтримку та захоплення вашою самовідданістю і невтомним духом усіх українців, що продовжують цю боротьбу. The project is co-hosted by PAN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. We are grateful to our partners for their continued support. They are the US Embassy in Ukraine, PAN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. Ми вдячні усім нашим партнерам за їх триваючу підтримку, а це Посольство США в Україні, наші традиційні партнери Пан Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Локальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та Інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми стрімимо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. Захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. And I will switch into English to introduce our lovely guest today. My name is Olha Mukha and I'm manager in PAN International and honored to be a member of PAN Ukraine. And today, I would like to introduce you our two brilliant guests. From Ukraine side, we have Sofia Cheliak, who is Ukrainian culture manager and the program director of the Lviv Book Forum since 2016, as well as being a translator and TV host. In 2022, Sofia started work at the Ukrainian Book Institute as a curator of Ukraine's national stands and to international book fairs. Since February, she has curated national stands at Bologna Children Book Fair, London Book Fair. Thank you for giving me a lot of job, by the way. Paris Book Fair in Wrocław, and Prague Book Fair as well. And a few years earlier, she began working as a TV host on First Fast Channel, Book Heroes, with a 5-minute explainer on Ukraine and world literature. Since the Russian invasion began, she had worked for the national TV, the National Regional Marathon, and both Culture News Report and host of Culture Instinct. And in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine and the protection of Ukrainian culture, I believe we're going to talk about it today a lot, you have said that book festivals act as a place of exchange and solidarity, where Ukrainian culture retains in space to be heard and to exist. You have expressed your own experience on the war in a piece entitled Ukrainian Lottery. That was a strong one. And as a member of Ukrainian Lab Writing Residency, and there you recount on understanding of morality in war and growing up faster than living in situation of perpetual conflict and uncertainty. And you end your piece with a striking line: rockets did not hit Lviv that day. We survived, and we had one more day to be young. I think this is a great start for what Sofia will deliver us today. And Sofia will hold her dialogue with a great woman. I want to start with a huge thanks for the letter of support for Sever Mustafiev you wrote over weekend and probably even overnight to recognize Day of Imprisoned Writers in November, literally a month ago, and support our colleagues persecuted and imprisoned for freedom of expression. Thank you very much, Margaret. We really appreciate it. Margaret MacMillan is a Canadian historian, author of best-selling books, and the Professor Emeritus of International History of the University of Oxford. As a leading academic on the First World War and international history in the 19th and 20th centuries, she is a prize-winning author and has written the books The War That Ended Peace, we shared with Sofia in Paris 1919, and your recent book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us, explores war as an element for our existence. And I found for myself a lot of insights while reading it. It outbreaks and its influence in how it influences our societies. And in the context of today's war in Ukraine, you've noted how your role as a historian is to raise the public awareness, right, of the past and to discredit false claims, especially as you believe Putin is now using history as an instrument of war by falsely interpreting history to fuel the conflict. And this experience of war and the commenting of importance of literature in terms of conflict in The Guardian, you mentioned similarly to Sofia that how war becomes a confrontation to one's morality. But you also mentioned how books have a role in allowing us to understand this reality and how they became an outlet of hope and of the triumph of good. Let's hope that we will talk about those things today. So I am presuming that we will have great conversation with a lot of insights, and passing stage to you, dear Margaret. Please, stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Ola, and that was a very kind introduction. And it is a great privilege to be doing this and to be adding whatever I can to the terrific work of PEN International at this very difficult time for Ukraine and for Ukrainian culture. I'm very conscious as I look at Sofia that I'm sitting comfortably in Oxford. My lights are on. I expect them to remain on. I can go to the shops. I can live my life as I normally live it. And you're living in Lviv. You're living in a very different world. You're living with much more uncertainty. And I wonder if you can tell us, particularly for the international audience, what that world is like. I mean, we are approaching getting awfully close to the anniversary of the war. Did your world change on the 24th of February last year? And how has it changed?
Thank you, Margaret. I am so excited to be here today. And Olha, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and especially thank you for help within the London Book Fair last year. Basically, of course, it changed greatly, and it changed really fast. Like we've mentioned with Olha, London Book Fair. So it was a day when the missiles hit Lviv the first time, and basically the sirens had started, and I was going to my home with like a huge package of books going to be sent to London, like for book fair. And I was outside to hear the first missiles hitting Lviv, and I was quite scared, but on the other hand, I was like in my head, I was joking a joke, okay, it will be really easy to identify my body because of like Ukrainian intellectuals' books are going lying around. So we started to joke a lot with really dark humor. On the other hand, of course, it's quite uncomfortable living in a war, especially after the blackouts has started. But this uncomfortable, they're not necessary. And we are not thinking about them a lot because we know that our friends who are fighting for us now in war situation, because of they're really in the cold, in frozen weather, under the snow, having the battles right now, and day after day, night after night, they are fighting for us. So here we are staying and like trying to make our schedule to catch a light and to make a walk. But on the other hand, war has given me the opportunity to open a big love for people everywhere in the world, in Ukraine. I was opening my home to people escaping the war from the east, from the Kiev region, from the south, and they were just like staying in my home and being also so kind and polite, like trying to help me how much they could. On the other hand, we were starting to share our emotions really openly, because Sophia understands that like it could be like everything could happen, and we should say everything. We should say that we love somebody or really worry about somebody. And of course, on the other hand, we opened big hate and maybe disgusting to our enemy. And of course, it's really natural feeling. We are really shy about it, but sometimes we just can't stop our angriness. But we are trying our best, like we really try. But living under attack, it's sometimes you are behaving not really as you did before you faced with the danger. So staying here is quite like sometimes it's uncomfortable, telling you in general, but on the other hand, I suppose this is the best time of my life, because of I can see people from the best side, and I can feel their love, and they are always ready to help, and I'm always ready to help. And it's really big and huge emotion.
It strikes me very much what you're saying about the ways in which war, which is of course based on brutality and violence and death, can bring out the best side in human nature, just as it can bring out the worst side. And clearly in Ukraine, it has brought out things that perhaps you didn't even realize were there before. You talk about yourself, but also with Ukrainian society. Can you, maybe it's too soon to tell, but can you see ways in which Ukrainian society has changed since the war started?
Since the full-scale invasion began, I got a feeling that the whole country had the same mood as the Maidan had. Like at Maidan, we were sharing everything. We were like helping
the demonstrations against the government. Yes.
Because of we were believing in what we are doing, and this common feeling, our dreams about our future, it give us a power and make us really gathering together. So the same I faced within the full-scale invasion. And I must tell you, right now we realize that this is the first time we have something huge like revolution, but it's the first time we are not against our government, but we are like support our government, like we are supported by our government. And this unit right now is unique for Ukraine, but it's really impressive. And you know, we are collecting like a lot of Ukrainians right now, we are volunteering. So we are finding a way to buy some like big expensive things, and we are collecting money, like just common people are asked by someone to buy, for example, drone or car, or I don't know, like something like really expensive, and people are believing to strangers, and they are sending the money, and the stranger, like volunteers, are buying like all these goods and like posting a photo. So maybe 20 years ago, it's something unbelievable in Ukraine to be like this, because we had this post-Soviet trauma, and we had this post-Soviet way of living. And of course, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was quite hard, because we didn't have the institutions to help us, to organize, to be involved in. So our eastern neighbors, they were more lucky, because of they used to be the part of Warsaw Agreement. But on the other hand, they did have a chance to keep their own institutions, like church in Poland. But in Ukraine, it was forbidden, and it was like quite harder than it was in the West. So right now, we believe each other. We do have the institutions. When the 21st began, and the next days I was shocked. I was really privileged, like, to buy an oil in Kharkiv when it was like in danger, to help my friend pick up their parents from a village and like put them in a safe place. So all of us, we became a part of a big network. So for me, it was like something, it was a miracle. And this networking are working, and we are helping like people from government, people from NGOs, people from parties, from armed forces, civilians, like business. We are all now together, and it's impressive. But I was starting to tell a lot about the 21st, and I would love to ask you, how did you feel on the 21st of February when it happened? Because of course, like everybody asking us, and I was often asked this question, but I'm really interested in your story.
Well, I think I was like a lot of people. I mean, I spend my life studying international relations, and I spent a lot of time studying war. So you think that I would be more prepared for war than I was. But I think I had got used to the idea that Europe was never going to have a major war again. Since 1945, there have been conflicts in Yugoslavia, but people said that was a civil war. And there have been insurrections, certainly in Ireland. There was, again, a civil war in Northern Ireland, and there have been violence in parts of Spain, but not a major war between two different states. And I think I had got used to the idea, which I think most of us had, that Europe had moved beyond war and was not going to do anything like this again, and that President Putin was simply bluffing, that he was trying to put pressure on Ukraine, except we should have noticed, of course, that he had used war already in Georgia and Chechnya and in seizing parts of Ukraine, and he had used war and violence already in Syria. But I think we kept thinking he doesn't really mean it. And it reminded me very much of the attitudes of Europeans in 1914, before the First World War. A lot of Europeans felt that Europe had made such extraordinary progress in the 19th century. It had become so prosperous, it had become so powerful. It had been, by and large, peaceful. I mean, Europe was never completely peaceful, but the 19th century was not a bad century for Europe. And in 1914, a lot of people said, this can't be happening. And I think that was my feeling last February, that it can't be happening. And now, of course, we are approaching the year-long anniversary of the war breaking out. And I think we've become used to the idea that it is happening. And I think it has been a real shock, much more a shock for Ukraine, but I think it's been a shock for the international system. I think it's been a shock for Europeans, but even further afield, I think it's been a shock for people living in different parts of the world that this can be happening. So can I ask you a question now?
Okay.
Because I was very struck about what you said about how Ukraine came much closer. But for people who aren't familiar with the recent history of Ukraine, who might be watching this, the protests in the Maidan were not against the present government, which has, I think, been very much supported by the Ukrainian people, but against a pro-Russian government.
Yes.
And I suspect,
sorry.
I suspect, I may be wrong, that you won't be having too many pro-Russian governments in your future. But you may want to comment on that. But also, can you tell me, because you've been so much involved in books and the world of the arts, how important in the coming together of the country, and how important in your enduring the war have books been, has reading been, have the arts been generally?
I must tell, like, I would love to back to the story with protesting against Yanukovych. Yanukovych, he was pro-Russian, but also he was trying to create the authority in Ukraine. A lot of people didn't believe basically in Ukraine because we were really close culturally, really close with media, that Russia, like with business, with everything, that Russia ever would able to invade Ukraine. So basically only small part of people were protesting on Maidan understand that maybe it could be the beginning of the war and our big enemy is Russia. But in majority, we were fighting again, like for freedom against the authority. So it's I need to add this to start the question. before the full-scale invasion and before the war ever happened in 2014, we were really close with the basically with the literature connection also with Russia. For example, Russian writer Zakhar Prilepin, I'm really ashamed of it. He was a participant of our festival in 2012, and in 2 years he became a soldier of DNR, fighting against Ukrainian and killing. So, and after he demobilized, he started to write books about his experience. He was already a writer, and Russia was using him as a main star of Russian national stands around the Europe. So at that moment, I realized that books and literature is not only books and literature, that they could be used. Here in Ukraine right now, the most popular books are books about our history. Because of course, like we should be honest, we were living under the Russia propaganda and under the Russia legend of Ukrainian history. Like, for example, like a lot of people were thinking that narratives that Lenin created Ukraine, like it was true. And they were believing in narratives that we are brotherhood nations, like three of us, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And of course, after the beginning of full-scale invasion, people were shocked that our brotherhood nation could do this. And of course, they started to be fascinated why it happened. And they started to go into history, go into the literature of 20th century, finding the answers. And right now it's quite important. Of course, people are reading basically with the beginning of blackouts. In Ukraine, people began to read more because of when you're sitting without internet connection and with only like one light like this, you are like have nothing to do like than read. Of course, there are a lot of people fighting for us, asking for books. So can you imagine we are like shipping packages and sending the books to the front line, and they are asking for some good novels, Ukrainian novels, or some entertainment novels, or of course the books about history and philosophy. And it's quite fascinating because of Olha Kruk, she's a Ukrainian writer. She had a speech during the Berlin Literary Festival, and he mentioned that Russian writers are more privileged because, of course, they could be arrested, but they could leave their country and not be involved in what is going on. And of course, they could read and they could study, they could do in their PhD and whatever they want to do. But Ukrainians, because of in majority we are involved, we are really involved emotionally, physically into the war. We don't have this opportunity to read. But we are trying our best, and we understand that we have so little time. So we need to read and go into literature. And sorry.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
It's my turn. And I would love to back to your answer. Speaking about the situation had happened is really similar to the situation after World War I. So my question is about crisis of international treaties and institutions in general, and maybe some blindness according to Russia, because of I know that Russia in the beginning of 90s, it was like the center of the world. And a lot of people would love to go there to see the new democracy born in and to see this processing and to cover it. But after Putin became a leader, he was starting to work on on a new regime and on a new totalitarianism. And of course, everyone was thinking about that, that he is bluffing. But according to the history lessons, the situation right now is quite similar we had before the World War II, when the fascism and Nazism were burning. Why like, we were like trying to be teach the lessons after the World War One and World War II, but why we were so blind, and why all the world haven't noticed that the new evil is burning?
I think we want peace, most of us. I think there are not that many in this world who want war, and so we tend to be always looking for signs that peace is the order. And I think, of course, history never repeats itself completely. It's never exactly the same, but there are very striking parallels. And I think what happened in Russia, as I understand it, is what had happened to Germany and other parts of Central Europe after the First World War. And that is, there had been a breakdown of the old order of society, that suddenly communism and the rule of the Communist Party suddenly ended in Russia. And the 1990s were a dreadful time for many Russians. They were all right for the oligarchs. It was all right for those who were in the FSB. It was all right for those who were in positions of power. But for a lot of Russians, their world was turned upside down. People couldn't get jobs. There wasn't money. And I think Putin, when he came to power, offered stability. And I think there was almost an implicit bargain that the Russian people, who had been through, I think, very, very difficult times at the end of communism, decided that they wanted stability more than anything else, and they were prepared to take less freedom. Democracy hadn't worked for them. I mean, they didn't really get a chance to try democracy, but it hadn't worked for them. And I think what you also had in Putin and those around him were people who understood power, but they didn't understand much more than that. And they didn't want cooperation, they wanted control. And often with regimes like that, and it was true of Hitler's regime, it was true of Mussolini's regime, it was true also of Stalin's regime, such regimes rely on keeping people quiet. If they can, they will give them an improvement in the standard of living. But they also often look for enemies. They look for enemies at home, or they look for enemies abroad, because it's a way of mobilizing people. And I think for President Putin, he has tried to use the threat, as he sees it, from others. He blamed a lot of the pro-democracy movements in Ukraine and in Belarus and elsewhere, and in Russia itself, on Western influence. He assumed that these were not natural to these countries. He assumed that it was all being stirred up by the Americans or by evil forces. And he talked this language of enemies, that we must mobilize against these enemies. And also, I think he promised the Russians, and this is often, again, what dictators or authoritarian leaders will do, they promise glory. We're going to become very powerful. We're going to rebuild the Russian Empire. We're going to gather back all the land that Peter the Great and Catherine the Great once ruled over. And this, I think, was, he thought, something that would help to keep him in power, help to keep the Russian people moving in the way that he wanted. And I think he thought it would be easy. And this is often a mistake that dictators make, because there is a real problem. If you become a dictator, nobody tells you the truth anymore. Or if they tell you the truth, you don't like it and you don't listen to them. And so dictators often end, and you can see this throughout history, they often end by making terrible mistakes because they no longer have the capacity to make judgments. And you think of how isolated people like Stalin became, or how isolated people like Putin have become. And I think particularly, of course, with Putin during COVID, when he was even more isolated. And I think he thought, and you would know better than me because you've lived through it, but I think he thought that he would easily take over Ukraine. He'd already taken Crimea, and the West hadn't done anything very much, and hadn't got, he'd got away with it. He'd already tried to detach parts of Ukraine in the east, and again, the West hadn't done very much. There was a sort of frozen war there. He'd already invaded Georgia, taken pieces of Georgia, taken pieces of Chechnya, and I think he thought it would be easy. And I think all the stories that are now coming out is that the Russians assumed they would have a puppet government in Kyiv in about a week. after they invaded. And I think he failed to recognize that there was, as you say, there has been growing, and it's become, of course, much stronger because of Israel. But even before that, there had been growing a very strong sense of Ukrainian nationhood and a sense among Ukrainians that they wanted to determine their own fate. They didn't want to be told what to do. Mm. But I think also with Putin, what you have is someone who thinks that force can settle everything. You know, he believes in applying force. And force, as we know, can do a lot, but it can't settle everything. Yeah. And in some ways, I think, I mean, you will never want to put up a statue to him in Ukraine, but he has probably done a lot to help create a united Ukrainian nation, which is not what he intended. But again, I think it's a very good example of how dictators make mistakes.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Sofia, because we've been talking about the Russians, and I was very struck. The Ukrainian writer Andrei Kirkov, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was talking at Oxford about a month ago, and he said I think he wrote in Russian up to this point, but he said he now doesn't want to write in Russian anymore. He wants to write in Ukrainian. How common is this now among those who are primarily Russian speakers? And also, what has it done? What has the war done to Ukrainians' attitudes towards the great Russian writers, such as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky?
So, starting with the language, I will start with my private story. Because I was born after the independence of Ukraine. I was born in the west part of Ukraine, and all my life I was speaking only Ukrainian with my parents in my school. And I must tell you that right now it's quite easy for me to speak in English, but it's something unbelievable. I can hardly speak Russian because of I didn't have the proper studying, and I am not the only one. There are a lot of people in Ukraine, young people, can't properly speak in Russian or write in Russian, of course, because we do have the television in Russian and could listen to music and watching movies and reading books. We are good in reading in Russian, and we are good in listening. But of course, after the beginning of full-scale invasion, a lot of people finally understood that Putin was right, telling one of his most famous narrative is that Russia ends when the Russian language ends. So he was using it, and he was using it, for example, defending the lands of Crimea or Donetsk and Luhansk region. He was like protecting Russian speakers there. So, but for a lot of Ukrainians, it was like kind of something like unbelievable, because of they were thinking that language is not politic, but it is. The same is with Russian literature. We are really known with Russian literature. You know, we are a lot of people in Ukraine have read not only like one or two pieces of Dostoevsky, but full collection, and Bulgakov and Tolstoy and Pushkin. We were reading them in school. We do have like big libraries in our homes to have a chance to read them, because of it was the most popular writers in Russia. And we were proposed, and of course we all are reading in Russian, so we were proposed to read them, and we were taught that Russia literature is the best literature in the world. So we should have no doubts. And like there is something sad and something really primitive. This is Ukrainian literature. And of course, after you listen to it, like 70 years of Soviet Union, okay, like not 70, but before 30, so I mean 40 years in Soviet Union, and after like 20 or 30 years during the independence, of course, in one day you realize that you are starting to open Ukrainian culture, and you are decided that the Russia culture in general is an enemy Russia was using. It's a weapon Russia was using also to involve people into culture, involve people into narratives, explaining these narratives to people and like giving a common examples. So a lot of Ukrainians right now are for not reading Russian literature right now, and they're for not having a contact with cultural workers from Russia, just because of, I mentioned the Prilepin case. You never know with whom you are talking. And on the other hand, it's a big trigger for Ukrainian. So when right now I was speaking with a lot of people, they could be Russian speakers, but when they are listening to film dublated into Russian with like Russian proper accent, they're starting to retraumating. They're like listening to the voices, and they are listening to the language, and they are remembering Putin, they are remembering Shoigu, and they're journalists talking and like using propaganda. So right now it's really hard to talk about Russian culture with Ukrainians, just because of it's really triggering.
Yeah, it's very sad, isn't it? That this, I mean, we would like to think that great literature, like great art, great music, belongs to everyone, and it should be able to cross borders, and it has done. But what wars will do is drive wedges and make it impossible to listen to something or read something that you once might have loved. And I think in the First World War, British and French orchestras, for example, refused to play any German music because they saw it as somehow symbolizing the enemy. And the Germans did much the same. And again, in the Second World War, the music of Wagner, which the Nazis used as a symbol of German culture, was something that others didn't want to listen to. And of course, for a very long time, it was impossible to play any of Wagner's music in Israel because the memories were so bitter. And this is, I think, one of the things that is, it's what, there are many tragedies in wars, and this perhaps is not by no means the greatest tragedy, but it is very sad that something that should cross borders and should be dealing with our common humanity is divided up in this way. But I suspect perhaps for a generation, there will be now an aversion in Ukraine to Russian literature, to Russian music. I mean, I think over time. And of course, I wonder how much the Russian people themselves are aware of what is being done in their name. Those who are fighting must realize, their families must realize, but you know, the ones at home who get only government news, or who perhaps choose not to know. Because one of the things that strikes me from all the reports that are coming from Ukraine is that there is a very systematic attempt on the part of the Russian regime, I won't say all Russians, but certainly on the part of the regime and those who support it, to eradicate Ukrainian culture. I mean, the stories that are coming out, and I'd love you to say something about it, about the ways in which museums are being looted, libraries are being destroyed, histories in the occupied areas are being rewritten. How serious is this? Do you think it's having an impact on Ukrainian culture?
I would love to begin with commenting your previous sentences. When we are speaking about also about the Russia culture in Ukraine, we must understand that the Russia culture, it was the Ukrainian culture was colonial for Russian cultures for years. So it was quite hard to write in Ukrainian for decades, to read, to listen. So right now, maybe we should use this radical tool also to give a chance for Ukrainian culture being popular again, like being popular, just became popular with Ukrainians, basically, because of a lot of them haven't had these knowledges and haven't opened a lot of writers because of everything, like a lot of the best Ukrainian writers were censorship. For example, Vasyl Stus, he was quite known abroad, but in Ukraine, he wasn't known. He was forbidden to publish. And basically, he died in Gulag in 1985. few years before the independence. And it's somehow the Russian culture was influencing on Ukraine. Instead of Vasily Ukrainians were reading Brodsky probably, or someone being like writing in more common language.
Yeah.
But when we are talking about the influence, like Russia is attacking Ukrainian culture too. Before the beginning of full-scale invasion, we got the information that a lot of Ukrainian people involved in culture, influencers, are listed, and they're going to be under attack. And of course, we made quite a fun on it. Yeah, because of like, oh, look, it's quite privileged to be listed in Russia list. So are you in list, and are you? It was jokes, but they're really doing this. Few weeks ago, we were announced that Ukrainian writer Volodymyr Vakulenko, he was proactive and he was pro-Ukrainian openly. He was kidnapped and killed in Izium, and he was tortured just because of he was Ukrainian and Ukrainian writer. Few days ago, at the beginning, a few days ago, we got a celebration of 300 years of Skovoroda. Skovoroda, he was a Ukrainian philosopher, created the hard philosophy, and based on the Skovoroda texts, a lot of Russian philosophers, being unknown, they built their own ideas. So during the full-scale invasion, Russians were trying to hit all the buildings, all the places somehow dedicated to Skovoroda. We've been to Skovorodinivka, the museum of Skovoroda in Kharkiv region, and it was hit by missiles, but it was a target. It was a target because of it wasn't anything around to be target, and it couldn't be a mistake. They were hitting the museum of Skovoroda. Also, they destroyed a lot of libraries, a lot of theaters. They kidnapped and killed a lot of Ukrainian culture workers. For example, we also knew about the death of a Ukrainian musician being killed in Kherson because of he refused to cooperate with Russians. So, but the most hilarious, it was like a few days ago, the photo appeared. It's Mariupol Drama Theater. It was bombed by Russians, and a lot of people were inside, and a lot of them died because of the bombing. The bombing was really huge. Some of them were lucky, but in majority they died. So right now they're like putting a poster around the theater with the faces of Russian writers, with, for example, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Gogol, and Russian culture is a protection for Russian regime, and it's a protection. They are using the culture to hide their crimes they did. And speaking about crimes, I'm thinking about this question since the full-scale invasion began. At the beginning, we understood that people around the world, they don't know a lot about Ukrainian history, especially about our relationship with Russia, about the really bloody 20th century when they killed Ukrainians just because of their extra people. They organized genocide against Ukrainian Holodomor. And also, but it's not only crime Russia did. They were doing this similar crimes to every country being a part of Soviet Union. They did big war crimes against the civilians in Berlin, basically in the end, and not only in Berlin, but in Germany, after the end of Second World War and after like the occupation of Germany. And Nazis, they were condemned after the Second World War end, and it was the tribunal, and of course Soviet Union was in charge. No one of people who won the war was in charge, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, no one started to make a process to condemn the Soviet Union and maybe to analyze and to commemorate the people were killed and commemorate people and like to judge people did a crime. So how do you think could it be a reason for Russia to start to make this new idea and to prepare the wars they go in or they began?
You mean that the crimes they committed in the past are part of the reason why they're continuing to commit crime? I think, I'm not sure that I don't know enough about the thinking of those who've decided, or particularly on Putin's part. But I think what you have is a regime which, since 1917, and the Tsarist regime before could be pretty brutal. I mean, it often treated the subject peoples very badly. But certainly, once you had communism, the Bolsheviks' version of communism in Russia, they had a view of creating a new kind of society which somehow meant that you could dispose of the living people who were in the way. These people were seen as obstacles. And in a way, the Nazis did something very similar. The Jews were seen simply as people who stood in the way of this vision of a greater German people. And this, as we know, is very, very dangerous because you can justify any amount of crimes in this way. And I think Russia, or certainly the Russian government at the moment, is trying to do something similar when it claims that the Ukrainians are brainwashed, they're drug addicts. I mean, what are them? You've been charged with being many things, haven't you? But it's a way of dehumanizing your enemy so that whatever you do to them is excusable. And I think it is not, it seems to me that it comes out of a tradition of a government or a series of governments in Russia which have behaved like this. Not all the Russian people behave like this, and not, we know that. But I think there is this long tradition of governments manipulating, moving people around, eliminating people, and not really seeming to worry. I mean, I don't think Stalin ever had any remorse for the millions of people who died under his rule. He simply saw them as inconvenient, and it was better to get them out of the way. And I'm not sure the present Russian leadership feels any remorse. In fact, I think they are annoyed, as much as we can tell. The Ukrainians have resisted, and they see this as somehow wrong on the part of the Ukrainians. And of course, what they're also trying to do is, and you've talked about this, is get rid of Ukrainian history, to rewrite the history so that there never was Ukraine, there's never Ukrainian national consciousness. And these narratives can be very powerful. Unfortunately. But I think what has happened as a result of the world, and you mentioned this earlier, the war, what you mentioned earlier on, is that there is much more awareness, not just in Ukraine, but in the rest of the world, about Ukraine as a people today. And I think that is something which will not be changed. I mean, it will not be forgotten once the fighting comes to an end.
Yeah.
What?
I suppose we can see Olha, and it's time.
I'm just wondering.
I'm back, and I have questions to both of you. And actually, I wanted to refer to this narrative, especially on an international level, you just mentioned, Margaret, because this is a personal pain of mine when I open in Britannica and it says that Russia starts from 9th century and Ukraine starts from 1991. And this is a great example how those narratives are quite important just to review and to discuss. But there I have one question, which is to both of you, and one personally to Margaret. The first one is, how do you think, where are the boundaries of using culture as an element of propaganda? This is for Margaret. And for Sofia, counter-propaganda, if those exist in the situation of war.
Yes, everything gets used in war. It depends on the nature of the war. It depends on how encompassing it is. But in the case of Ukraine, it's a war for its survival. And Ukrainian science, Ukrainian philosophy, Ukrainian thinkers, Ukrainian resources, Ukrainian people will contribute to this war effort. And I think, for better or worse, culture will get involved because, and it happened, it happened in the Second World War. Let me give the example of the British writers, British filmmakers devoted their talents to trying to promote the war effort. Now, this may not be what they wanted to do, but they saw it as important and necessary. And I think, from what I gather, the same thing is happening in Ukraine, that writers who might not want to write politically find themselves now in a position where it is simply part of what they do. I'm sure Sofia can comment more than I can on that one.
I guess most of our colleagues were complaining that since February 24th, they stopped writing fiction. They're mostly writing, essays, articles. They are just trying to make Ukrainian voice louder, right?
Yeah. Well, they have a talent, and in a crisis like a war of this nature, the talent becomes very important, and perhaps writers write for themselves, but perhaps at the moment they feel they can't just do that. I don't know. Sophia, what do you think?
Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, a lot of writers starting to work on explanation what is going on in Ukraine and about the historical background, cultural background, because of all of them realize that they knew languages, they have knowledges, and they can help our country being a part of informational war.
Yeah.
I was working for National Marathon, and I'm working for TV, and our interview program is dedicated on counter-propaganda narratives and way how we could. We are talking with intellectuals about the Russian narratives against Ukraine, about Ukrainian culture, just to open the eyes to Ukrainians and explain them what is going on. And a lot of people around Ukraine are into this. I feel really emotional about what I'm doing, and I feel that I'm doing the right things. That's what people are needed, and that's what I need personally. So when I'm making it with the feelings and with the passion, I don't think it's a propaganda. It's just a way you are expressing your creativity, and it's just a way you are gathering all your knowledges and trying to give something to people. You think it could be useful.
Yeah, I think you're giving them their voices, aren't you? I mean, you're helping people to express things that they may feel, and perhaps you can help more do it. Can I just say something about the narrative?
Okay,
of course.
It seems to me this is in a way a sort of the narrative that Russia was founded in the 9th century, that Kievan Rus then became Muscovy, then became Russia. It seems to me irrelevant. What matters is what the Ukrainian people themselves want. And you can't say the Ukrainian people must be part of Russia because of something that may or may not have happened many centuries ago. I believe in self-determination of people. The Ukrainian people voted overwhelmingly to leave the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union fell to pieces. It didn't want to join the Commonwealth. It wanted to be independent. It's quite clear that Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. And so, for all the talk of, Ukraine was once this, was once that, it seems to me that that doesn't count as much as what the Ukrainians living today want. And they have a voice, and I think it should be respected.
But on the other hand, I must add, we did in 1994 the same thing like Belarus did also. They were also for building the independent country. But on the other hand, we we see Russia was influencing Belarus really hardly. They did have the authority leader being really close to Russia, and particularly now Belarus, it's not officially part of Russia yet, but they're really, really closely connected.
I think to use that we used to call it it's politically and culturally occupied territory.
Yes. Fully. And they were trying to do the same things with Ukrainians. I suppose few years later, if we were not succeed with Maidan, we will be in the same situation Belarus are. So unfortunately.
Yeah. And Belarus, we don't know because there were vast demonstrations there against the Lukashenko government. There's never been a chance for the Belarusians to say what they want.
Yeah.
And so we don't know what they would say. But I think it's very clear what Ukrainians would say. And, I think, a lot of the history that Russia is putting out is quite wrong. And Timothy Snyder, among others, and so Sergei Plokhy have been very good on this. A lot of it simply doesn't make sense. And the idea that Crimea, for example, has always been Russian. No, it hasn't. It was only absorbed into Russia in the 18th century. But and I think it is important to challenge this false history. But the thing, I think I go back to, it's what the Ukrainians want today. It's their voice that matters, not what someone sitting in isolation in the Kremlin wants.
You almost responded to the second question I had for you.
Oh, sorry.
What has to be the most important message about Ukraine and its culture for the Western audience today?
I think the most important thing is that Ukraine is a culture. It has its own values, and we must respect that, and we mustn't fall into accepting the Russian narrative that there's never been a Ukraine. As I say, what happened centuries ago doesn't matter. You could argue that the whole of France should belong to Britain because centuries ago it did. This doesn't, to me, make any sense. It doesn't deal with realities existing today. And the other thing I think that's very important for Western audiences to understand, and Sofia has already talked about this, is that those in Ukraine who speak Russian are not Russian citizens. And they're not necessarily, and in fact, most of them are not pro-Russian. I think for too long, Western journalists tended, but partly because I think a lot of us didn't know much about Ukraine, not just Western journalists, but others, tended to accept the view that anyone living, and particularly in the east of Ukraine, who spoke Russian really was Russian. And that seems to be clearer and clearer now, that I would say probably the majority of those people don't feel themselves to be Russian, even though they speak Russian. And they have cousins across the border. But it's like Canadians. We have a lot of cousins in the United States. We speak the same language. We don't feel ourselves to be American.
Yeah. I would love to add one more thing. Ukraine succeed to become a political nation. During this war, not only like ethnical Ukrainians are fighting for Ukraine and wanna live in a free country, but a lot of nations like Crimea Tatars, like Jews, like Romas, Polish people like born here and have Ukrainian passport, but also ethnical Russians are fighting for Ukraine. Like there are a lot of people being ethnical Russians, like growing up here, having Ukrainian passports, and they feel themselves as ethnical Russians, but they understand that they're Ukrainian citizen and they should know Ukrainian language and they should protect it, and somehow they should help. So yeah, it's also like really strange, especially according to the Russian narratives, that we are helping Russians being here, but Russians who were born here, they don't want to be a part of Russia, in Russia.
Yeah, no, that's very, I'm sure that's absolutely true. Do you have another question for us? Or
no, sadly not. I have a lot of comments. I had a lot of comments, especially when you mentioned protecting great Russian writers. I had a lot of heating comments. I would like we to start asking, how can we protect great Ukrainian writers, just to have a chance to have them before another aborted renaissance happened, right? Because honestly, when Sofia was sharing some details on targeted attacks on Ukrainian culture, I could share the very same. I work a lot with Kherson, Mariupol, Melitopol, and how Russians would come for Ukrainian teachers from school and were targeted focusedly, librarians, burning children books and such things. Sometimes it feels even that it's surrealistic, but this is what's happening right now. And it just discovers like how those cultural things can be very important, probably the basic of the whole thing, how it framed. But what always really, really hits me, this is this incredible resilience of Ukrainians. Sofia, each time, I just want to mention it, each time when you would ask some difficult questions, Sofia would respond, and we have some jokes about that.
Yeah,
we were laughing on it. And we had those memes, right?
Yeah.
And this is an incredible thing. And another thing, what I want to quote today, because usually we are asking ourselves intellectuals around the world, like, what can I do today, right? Mm-hmm. And today I'm going to quote our guest again, Sofia, who said, I live best time of my life. I can see people from their best side. Yeah. Show your best side. Use the chance. Use this incredible opportunity window to show the best side of humanity. Yeah. And this is what our dialogues are about. It's wider perspective, sometimes uncomfortable questions, and very honest answers. Today, I would say very good answers. Yeah. And thank you very much for this very engaging conversation. A lot of things, but it always calls for more. But this all would not be possible without the support of our partners, the US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. And the gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, who manage, I would say, because we checked the electricity blackouts agenda, and today, particularly in this time, Sofia had not to have electricity, but I can say that the miracle happened and electricity here, and she stayed with us. Yeah. So, and so Pan International, we are proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression, and we hope those dialogues give you enough insights and materials for deep thinking. Thank you again, our great speakers. That was pure pleasure and great privilege.
Well, it's been a great privilege for me, and I just admire what Sofia and what you are doing so much. And if I can contribute in any way, very small way, it's a privilege, as I say. But thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm really big fan of your works, basically, I must say. So it was like something really dreamy to talk with you today and to have a chance to ask you questions. Yeah. And also big thanks to Olha being so polite and for such a great introductions and conclusions.
Yeah, and I hope we will all meet in Lviv one day.
Yes, yes.
I look forward to it.
That's our New Year dream for sure.
Good.
So stay with us. The next episode will be held next week on December 20. That's episode number 28. And we will host Olha Gerasimyuk, Ukrainian journalist, TV presenter, and the chairwoman of the National Council of Ukraine on Television and Radio Broadcasting, and Christina Lamp, one of Britain's leading foreign correspondent and best-selling author. You definitely know her from I Am Malala and Our Bodies There Battlefield. Follow our dialogues on war, spread the word, and stay with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.